Okay. So just, I mean, this is a little bit repetitive for most of us, but just in case we have new people joining us, we are a self-organized group which studies AI-related topics. We meet every Sunday, like today, and we meet here in Zoom. The sessions are recorded and published in Santiago Vique's YouTube channel. So in case you want to see the previous ones or even the ones from other books, they are all there. And what we do is we basically volunteer each week a different person to lead the discussion of the next chapter. Everything is discussed in our Discord group. And we have already completed 2 books, Building an LLM from Scratch and AI Engineering. All the sessions are there, so you can check them out. And now, from the last 2 weeks, we have been studying LLM Engineer's Handbook by Paul Justin and Maxime Labon. And we have done the 2 first chapters. It's a book about getting our hands dirty with a real project. In this case, it's building an LLM twin, which is to tweak an LLM to generate texts in the style of a particular person. In this case, we're going to be doing it with examples of publications of the authors themselves. And we already covered that first chapter, which describes this LLM twin project, and the second chapter, which was about the tools that we are going to be using, SendLM for the pipelines, etc. And today we're going to get started with a session that Patrick Kennedy is going to be leading about data engineering. And just as a quick reminder, when he finishes, we will have like a question and answers time. You can also make questions, like raise your hand, and you can make questions even while he's making the presentation. But at the end, after the questions and answers, we will ask for someone to volunteer. This chapter is going to be the 3rd chapter, but I believe that we are going to split it. We're going to do the, sorry, a second. Always happens in my house. We're going to be doing just the first half because it's a very big chapter. So we're going to be asking for the person who wants to volunteer the second half of the 3rd chapter. And also we decided that it won't be this week because we haven't launched the new beginner sessions yet, but next Sunday we will be studying the 1st chapter. And after a poll that we ran to basically choose the day, we decided that it was going to be after the sessions that we are running, like today. So if this starts at 2 p.m. UTC, and it's a 90-minute session, then after that, next week, we will do the first beginner lesson. And it will be like that after the normal sessions. So that means that we will also be asking for someone to volunteer the 1st chapter, which is, by the way, I didn't write it in the presentations, but it is about hands-on, how is it called? Machine learning with Scikit and PyTorch. I believe that's the title, by Aurélien Geron. So that's it. And with that, I will just stop and leave Patrick lead us today.
Okay, great. You're going to have to unshare your screen and I'll share mine.
Okay.
So let's see. Right here, share. I think that's it. Oops. Let me make sure I shared it again. There, I see. Okay. Does it look good? Can you see my desktop yet? Okay, can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to launch that. Whoops. No. Edit, undo that. So I'm going to go, well, let me get up to the top again. There we go. And then I'm going to launch it. 1 second, I forget how to do that. Okay, yeah, slideshow. Okay, Here we go. LLM Engineers Handbook, Chapter 3, Data Engineering. And so I just named it after our group on Discord, dis, Discourse, whatever. uh, I looked that up. AI from Scratch group, okay? And so text and materials in this presentation are largely drawn from the LLM Engineers Handbook, and which is currently published by Pact Publishing. Although, as people mentioned, it will be coming out in O'Reilly in a couple months more. So that should be interesting. And I did find one issue with the dependencies, so maybe that will be fixed in the next version. So the LLM Engineer's Handbook. Let's see. This chapter will explore the LLM Twin project in depth. We will learn how to design and implement the data collection pipeline to gather raw data, and we will use this data in all use cases such as fine-tuning and inference tasks. So we will design and implement an extract, transform, load pipeline to help us aggregate data. And the ETL pipeline will help us crawl web sources and aggregate the data into a MongoDB data warehouse, which I will typically just call a MongoDB database. We will also implement various crawling methods, standardize the data, and load it into the database. We will design and implement an extract, transform, load pipeline to help us aggregate the data. I think I just said that. The ETL pipeline will help us. Okay, I think I said that too. Let's go. Anyway, we will implement various crawling methods and standardize the data. Although I didn't really see which function call standardized the data. Normally there's a little bit more of the data normalization process, but I'm sure it's there at least nominally. This is mostly a prototype still, and we'll load it into the database. We will use ZenML to implement our pipelines. Okay, so I thought there was a way. So an ETL pipeline involves three fundamental steps: extract the data from various sources, transform this data via cleaning and standardizing it, making it suitable for storage and analysis, and load the transformed data into the database. So the first graphic here, you can kind of get a sense of how the pipeline is implemented for Medium, GitHub, and LinkedIn. It sort of wraps around and gets into this NoSQL database right here. And then it comes around and it feeds into this part, the RAG feature pipeline, etc. Now, I had my only concern or question was when it's coming out of the pipeline and going into that database, you think that you still have to do some security issue, and sometimes the data can be, untrusted data. So I think right here you need to do something in terms of sometimes escaping things or what, but you see the raw data, I can't be 100% raw. There must have been something in terms of security previously over here before it gets into the database. But you get the basic idea of the layout. But I really like this one more because it's going to focus more on the way the code is designed. You've got different data sources and you got different crawlers, and it's not one to one, and this makes the code more modular, and you don't always have to implement everything, which makes it more onerous to maintain. Instead, different data sources can use the same crawler. For example, the blog and the Substack can use the same kind of crawler. Okay, I believe that's the generic one. So, and then you got articles, data categories. You got articles, repositories, and posts. And so, it's studying this flow is very important because we'll see and develop it in the code. Okay, so now we want to design an ETL pipeline that accepts input of the user, an author, and a list of links. And it will then crawl each link individually, standardize the collected content, and save it to the MongoDB database. The ETL pipeline will detect the domain of each link simply by taking that earliest part, the first part, the domain name, and parsing that out. And it will utilize the appropriate crawler accordingly. And by reducing all the collected data to 3 data categories and not creating a new data category for each source, which I did mention, we will easily extend this architecture to multiple data sources with minimal effort. The ETL pipeline is separate from the feature pipeline. The two pipelines communicate with each other via the MongoDB database. The ETL data pipeline writes the data to the MongoDB database. The feature pipeline reads from it independently. So like the feature pipeline is like fine tuning or something like that. We haven't studied the feature pipeline yet. That will be in a future chapter. We're currently studying more the data pipeline, the digital data ETL pipeline that grabs the data. That's going to be the pipeline that we're going to focus on right now. So now we're going to introduce ZenML. Basically, that's how the pipeline will be implemented. And ZenML uses both a decorated pipeline and combines multiple steps that uses @step, which is a decorated step. So you've got 2 decorated concepts: the pipeline and the step. And so you can create a pipeline, and then inside that pipeline you will have multiple steps. It's very nice and organized, and that also helps things with like logging and metadata can be focused on that step and organized accordingly. This is very good. We implement our digital data ETL pipeline via ZenML. The pipeline's implementation is available in our repository. I'm speaking on behalf of the authors at pipelines/digitaldataetl.py. So naturally, you can take a look at that code, and it will give you great intuitions. We accept as input the user's full name and a list of links. We look up the user in the database and create a new user. So basically, it will look up the user up in the database, and if it's not found, it would create a new user. And we loop through the links and crawl each one independently for that given user/author. So here's the first code sample that is shared in the book. So you got 2 imports at the top. From ZenML, import the pipeline, and likewise you got the steps ETL that imports the crawler links and the get or create users. So those are our resources that we're going to require in order to make this program. So we just saw that very first line, from ZenML import pipeline. And you can see that the code below is decorated with @pipeline. So that gives it, using that decorated declaration, that decorated concept of @pipeline, it, it will allow the code certain functionality that will give it, you know, features of a pipeline. So then we declare the function define or whatever. We're going to define a function, digital data ETL, and we pass in the user's full name, and it says :str, so it's a string value. So it's got the type formally declared. Oftentimes you don't do that, but here we're being very, very rigorous and proper. So we've defined that this variable is going to be a string type. And then the second parameter going into the function is links, and it has a type. But instead of being a simple data type, like a primitive data type, well, a string is not exactly primitive, but here we have a list that is composed of strings. So that's what links is. Links is a list of strings, and then the function will ultimately return a string value. So yeah, like anything, you have to be able to read the syntax, and it does take time to get used to Python's way of doing things. And there's multiple different ways that it can be done. Are you doing Pydantic or this or that? There's so many different ways that it can be done. There's, it's a very rich ecosystem, and there are different ways that can be done. So here we get the full name of the user and a list of links, and then the first thing we do is we call get or create the user, and we pass in the user full name, and and that will ultimately return a user object. Now I wrote this code quickly. If you find any errors or if I omitted a line or whatnot, it's quite possible. So, there could be mistakes or whatnot. Now, last links, crawl links will accept two parameters, a user and the links. Okay. They obviously came from when they were first passed into the digital data ETL, and they're just passed in. Well, the user was actually defined right here from the second line of that function. So there we got the user being passed in, and then we got the original link object list of URLs being passed in as links equal to links. So we got the user object to the links passed into crawl links. So crawl links is gonna crawl the links, and then finally it returns some sort of useful function. I'm not sure why it's used yet. I didn't study the code that closely for this particular issue, but it will return a last step invocation ID. Perhaps it's added to the metadata or something. I did not look at exactly why it's doing that, but I'm sure sometimes you can't always do every line of code, but it's there for a reason. So we'll get into enough code. You'll see that you can't always study every single thing, but obviously you should know when something breaks or something. It's the devil's in the details. Okay, so you can execute the pipeline, which we will review shortly. So that was a lot of fun. I was able to execute the pipeline, and you can monitor and review previous executions of the digital data ETL pipeline on the ZenML dashboard, which is a separate tool, like a web browser-based tool that is installed later in the book. But it's shown in chapter 3 what it does look like, and it's important to study those, what the dashboard looks like, so that you understand how how things are being processed. The next steps of the code we started to review. Okay, the next steps of the code we started to review. Okay, I think I could rewrite that better, but so we got the get or create user and the crawl links functions are decorated. Okay, I think we already covered that. So probably need to edit that slide a little bit, but you get the idea. So taking a break now from the coding, we just did the first coding example. Now I'm going to step back. Let's review how to set up your local machine at a high level. Now, for my machine, an underpowered laptop, but maybe 5 or 6 years old, maybe 7 years old. It's an old laptop, but I'm not doing parallel processing, so it can do most of the tools, and Linux can be very lightweight. So I ran through chapter 2 and installed all the tools, mostly without incident. And there is a GitHub repository. So the first thing you should do is do git clone, and clone that repository, then step into that LLM Engineers Handbooks folder or directory. I used the backslash there because it was a long line, and I'm formally you can do that if you're on the command line. So that way you can literally just cut and paste that long 2 lines, and it would be understood and would pull down the whole repository. Okay, so I got an old laptop here, Debian 12. Bookworm runs fine on it though. So let's start with Python. I noticed that my current version was Python 3.11.2, and I also noticed it only launched with Python 3. It didn't have, quote, Python as a command, only Python 3. So that was interesting. Initially, what I did was I made an alias to Python before I began, but then I noticed that it exhibited an issue, and so I removed the alias later. So do not use any alias to create Python. If you have Python 3, that's fine. It will work better. Don't try to make an alias. Okay, so install py environment, the pyenv. So basically there's a curl. You have to install curl if you haven't done that before, which is very easy, apt get install, or just apt space install, and then curl. That's very easy to install. Then you can run that curl and grab the py environment.run URL domain, and it pipes into your bash terminal and installs it. And then you can configure it, and installation notes are listed right there. So if you have any problems, you can review the installation notes. However, here's basically what you do. There's 3 steps, and I did those 3 steps right there. And that's mostly what it should work out mostly. And then you reboot, although there is usually a way to do a refresh without a reboot, but most people don't know those kind of commands. So easy way is just reboot, but they don't always have to reboot with Linux, and so production systems, etc. But obviously, if you're setting something up, you can reboot it. But I'm just saying there are other ways. You don't always have to reboot. Now with Windows or something, you would definitely have to reboot, unless you're using their Linux shells and whatnot. They have other ways to do it. Okay, installing the dependencies. So this is, as I recall, right from the README. So then you test it, which Pi environment, etc. When you have questions, you can go to an LLM kind of AI tool like Perplexity. So then setting up the local machine. So basically, in review, okay. So once you've got Pi environment installed, you can upgrade to 3.11.8, which was the version, as I recall, that was used by the book. And then you go Pi environment versions, and it will confirm what's installed. Okay, and it make it global, the default one. Then you go Pi environment global. Okay. And then again, you can confirm it. Whoops. And see right there, I go Pi environment versions, and it says system, which was the older version. And then it's got the 3.11.8. Okay. My helpful little URL there. I should have changed that, but I'm releasing too much information there, but I always do that. So it shows you totally where it installed. And then I go Python version, and indeed it shows that it's the global now is globally available. Boom, there it is. So install Poetry. Now I getting pretty comfortable with Poetry, but that doesn't mean I've actually been using it. So I just installed it, and after that, I didn't worry about it. But naturally, if I was really doing a project, I'd want to do a quick tutorial and make sure I'm not missing a few things. Navigate to the following URL, blah, and the prerequisites is to install pipx. So you got to do app install pipx, and then you do pipx ensure path, and that configures and tests the configuration. But you have to do it. It's not just testing it, it helps to configure it. And then pipx install Poetry. So that's how you get Poetry going. There's different ways, though. There's not one way to do it. And it also depends on what platform you have. And you have to consult the documents. Okay, Poetry install without AWS. And so that's how you would install Poetry locally without AWS support. And then you go Poetry self-add, the Poetry plugin. Now that can create a problem, however. We'll get back to that in a second. But this is how you install the Poet. And that way you can run commands. And we'll get into that in a minute. It's not completely documented, but you'll get the idea. For Poetry shell, remove the plugin, you would go Poetry self remove the Poet. So here's the details. Integrating the Poet into Poetry, at least on Debian 12, as shown below, before the per the README files, it doesn't quite work. So therefore, the last two slides, that would be this one and this one. So this is how to install Poetry, and this is how to, well, it's really this one that's important. This is how you install the Poet as a Poetry plugin, and this is how to remove the Poet. Because you need both, because there's a technical bug, and the repository, the dependency says I cannot fully install blah blah blah, etc. I wish I documented better. I was saving all my results in a text file, and somehow I didn't document it quite as clearly as I wanted. But what I found is, a long and short, was there was a dependency issue, and sometimes you'll need to install the Poetry plugin for the Poet. You'll need to install it, and other times, in order to run the commands, you'll need to remove it. So anyway, I would have to do it again to document it better. But basically, you're supposed to be able to do this right here: tools, Poetry dev dependencies, and add the Poet that way. But it wasn't quite working, so I had to instead install or remove, depending on whether I needed to run a command on the command line or not. So it was a dirty hack or workaround, which I figured it out, and then I even asked Perplexity AI if this dirty hack wasn't a feasible way just as a kludgy fix, and Perplexity agreed that it was a viable solution, given that I was having a dependency issue. So that was for a dependency issue for Debian 12. It may not affect other platforms. So then Docker also was a very difficult, and I've had that experience several times on Debian 11 and Debian 12. So this is basically the steps you take to install Docker. But there was an error. I consulted Perplexity. It recommended this fix. However, I had to then run further fixes and then do this as well. And then I had to do this as well. But it finally worked. I was able to, this URL right here at the bottom shows Perplexity's help in getting the final, well, most of what you saw previously is shared in that Perplexity URL, or it should be properly shared. I tried to use the share feature. So you should be able to click on that link, type it in slowly and go there and understand the issue. If you're using Debian 12, that will be your possible fix, but it's not easy getting Docker always working on Debian. That's been my experience. Okay, so now how to run the digital ETL pipeline. So on this screen, if you run Poetry Poe, which won't work if you go back over here, sometimes I forget exactly, but if I think if you add Poe the Poetry plugin, it won't work, and then you have to remove the plugin, and then you can run. Let me go back to run the digital data ETL pipeline. Then you can do Poetry Poe run digital data ETL. So you naturally have to also edit your .env, the environment file, the hidden env file with your open API key, etc. I didn't do that. I knew I didn't do that. I simply tested my configuration. You just see what happens. Even if it crashes and burns, I just wanted to see it work. I even have my terminal session open. I could show you that. It definitely worked. It was great. It ran for like 12 minutes. It pulled down tons of data or errored out probably, but it didn't look, there were not a bunch of bombs and errors. So I assumed that it just pulled in no data. It didn't have, the API key. And so it just goes next, next, next. It was pretty clean output. It definitely worked, but naturally it's not properly done, but it tested solid, so that was good. Okay, so lots more great code in this chapter, and you've got to invest time and study each example to learn how to code. And MongoDB database has its own Python coding requirements as well. Okay, so basically I see that I'm only doing the first half, but you're going to see that I almost did the full chapter. So that will be a little bit of overlap for the next person to do the second half. So just FYI on that. Let's review some more code. Continuing on where we left off, let's review get or create user ZenML steps. So, we're doing ZenML. It's a ZenML type of pipeline. So there we got a bunch of from, blah, import, such and such. And so there are your imports. And then we've got a function, get or create user, and it's decorated with a step. And so that would be the first step, and there'll be a second step. And so here we got the function, define, def, get or create user, and it's taking a user full name which is of type string. So a string of the user full name is going to be passed in, and it's going to return some sort of annotated object. I did not study the annotate actual code, so I can't say it's definitely, is it a module or is it a class or this or that? I don't know, but I assume it's a class, but whatever. Maybe it's a list. I don't know. But anyway, you get the, sometimes you just have to keep on going to get the big picture. And object-oriented stuff, you just say, okay, whatever it is, I've got some sort of defined object called annotate, and it's got user data, and it's also like marked or flagged as user. So the user information is put into a user data, and then it's kind of marked or flagged as that's the way I interpret it with the string user. Okay, and then you do a little logger.info blah, and so it just adds the full username, and that'll be added to the metadata later. And then you got first name, last name, and you got a utility split user full name, and you pass in the user full name. So obviously it just splits the full username. You're just calling libraries, that's pretty easy stuff, and you're going to get the first name and the last name. So you could go line by line, and you add the metadata, etc. It's very readable code, even if some of it is abstract. Obviously, it will not be difficult to cut and paste this whole block into Perplexity or other great AI platforms and say, okay, what's annotate? This is the way. It's much easier to study code nowadays. All right, so let's review. Wow, okay, wow, I use that every time. So we got another helper function. If we go back at the code, look at the code, the last call right here is get metadata. So that's a helper, and that first underscore suggests that it's a helper or private kind of. You're not supposed to call it directly, and so it's being called by this function as a helper, and it's going to basically it's going to return. Whoops. It's going to return this dictionary, and so that will be, I have to study that a little bit more, but you'll get the, it's not difficult to understand the basic idea there. So get the metadata, and then, okay, I broke the line here. This get metadata really is metadata equal, and I made a return just so that the line wasn't so long. So the metadata is going to be equal to this dictionary right here. Okay, and then we so yeah, metadata, and that's add output metadata, which is added to the step context. Okay, so that and then ultimately it did its thing, and it modified the metadata, and then it returns a user object. No, the user has been used a couple different ways, so you have to study carefully the niceties of the code. But in any case, a user object, a more formal user object, is returned. Okay. So at any rate, then you would crawl the links. First, you start with crawl links, and here's the crawl links imports. Import annotated. So I think this one needs to be annotated, right? The annotated. I think that might be a little bug. So like I said, I typed all this stuff pretty quickly, and you don't have. The book will show you the syntax with nice colors for the different parts of speech, the different grammar parts. So if you want a better, but it's muscle memory. If you actually type code, you will get a lot more into the code. And also, because I typed it out, I can easily cut and paste it into. Now, I could have gone to the original code, and that's certainly more appropriate. But different ways, different ways to study the code, and so I also want to document it and present it. So that's why I put it right here. So in any case, as noted, it might be annotated with the D there. Yeah, it's easy to figure out. So here's the crawl links, and these are the imports for it, and this is the actual code for it. And then notice the for link in, and I didn't have time to to go TQDM, but obviously like DNS, how it's going to treat the domain names, and then the list of links go in to that function, and then it aggregates it and processes it, and then it also does stuff with the metadata there. So again, here's the for link, and I ran out of space. So here's a continuation. That's why I pounded out the for link in, because it's a continuation of the for link at that same level or indent. Okay, and so if you go back to the code, in that for link, there will be a call, I believe, to crawl link. So again, a helper function. So within this the for link in TQDM links, somewhere, as I recall, there is a call to the helper function. So offhand, I'm not seeing it, but anyway, it's something like that. So it's very straightforward. I don't have time to confirm it, but it's right there if you look at it. So anyway, it's a helper function, and here's the code for it right here. And there, it's going to have the author, which is still called user, and that's the way they want, just pass in the author's name as a user, and then the given link. And so each link in that list will be processed like this. And so then we add the metadata, which is another helper function. Okay. And finally, we are getting a good sense of how the code works, but there is still a little bit more to be done. And actually, there's a lot more to be done. So it starts to get into a crawler dispatcher. And inside the crawl links function there, it has this crawler dispatcher build, and it does register medium dot, and it chains on the other ones as well, which you can do in many programming languages. You could list them one by one, but then you got to combine them all into one aggregate variable. Or you can get register medium, register GitHub, register blah, and you just link 3 or 4 of them together like that. So you just chain them together. But I use the ellipses just to say, okay, you get the idea. And so the devil's in the details. You're going to have a crawler dispatcher. I talk about the details of it extensively, but most of this is just for intuition or the rough idea. You're going to have to study the code to get into it. Each crawler has a base class. It's called base crawler interface. Was it in an interface? I believe it was, yeah. And there's the code for it. And also the base class imports ABC abstract. ABC is Python's way of saying it's an abstract class. And not only can you have abstract classes, you have to define abstract methods, because not all methods need to be abstract. So abstract classes get fun. And if you've never done object-oriented coding, then I recommend a little bit of Java. But the second best, well, unless you want to go with C++, but that's quite fun indeed. I would recommend Python next. But Java, if you want to do a 3-week, 4-week crash course, or 2 weeks at least, there's some great books out there. I can recommend certain ones too. So each crawler has a base class, and then so that basically they're built on top of base crawler, and then there's also the the, the custom article crawler, and the document types: article, document, post document, repository document. It all goes back to that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 5 to 6. Okay, right there. It all goes back to this. So if you want to understand the code, this is a very important diagram to study. So basically, we're getting the basic idea, and then there's more stuff. Now I'm moving into the second half of the book. So basically, we're almost done because then we can discuss it. But instead of using an ORM pattern, it uses an ODM pattern, and so that's object. Well, yeah, object document mapping. And so this, instead of using like the ORM, the object relational mapping, which would map data into specific data types in a table row by row, instead it's more of it uses like JSON like documents, and those are stored as documents. So it's a slightly different paradigm, but very similar, actually. And so, if you've never studied MongoDB, it's worth kicking around a little bit. I haven't studied MongoDB that much, but I did study a couple little books over the last couple years. So yeah, I have enough background to understand it and not feel intimidated by it. But most of my background is SQL. I think most you want to start with an SQL background, I think, usually, but no, SQL is not that hard. It's usually a lot of fun. So so then it gets into generics. Generics, you'll find in TypeScript, Rust, and Python. It's a thing. It's popular, and it's important to know code like this. I looked up this example using Perplexity, and so that would be a basic example. I'm a little bit rusty at generics, but it's not hard to get into. Well, a little bit hard. If you haven't studied it before, it would be a little bit hard. But it's like anything. When you need it, you just do a crash course on it. So in conclusion, wow, that's the end of the thing. And so basically, you can see the code base is very robust and modular and powerful. It used I skipped over it, but some sort of Silesium or whatever library, and it uses some LangChain and etc. It's got some great stuff, and you can very effectively read websites and get them and parse that material, spider that material. So I do recommend a crash course on Java if you're weak on the object-oriented coding paradigm. And there are many good Python sources that exist too. And I also recommend studying generics because as you can see, there is a little bit of generics towards the end when it's using the MongoDB database and dealing with that. Finally, some quick studying of MongoDB would be helpful, obviously, if you've never studied it before. But anybody that's done LAMP and WAMP and MAMP, it's not that hard to get into MongoDB. It's actually pretty fun stuff. And that's it. So I will stop sharing my screen in a second. 1 second. All right. Let me find you guys. There we go. Any question? I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand up because I had my thing. Yeah,
I was applauding. I was applauding. Great presentation, Patrick.
Okay. So that's my presentation. Any questions, or anyone want to share anything?
I love that we are getting in like our hands dirty in from this part of the book. Like I love seeing a lot of code. It makes us. I don't know if it happened to you, Patrick, but like you have to spend a lot more time to read a page, especially when it's a page of code, because it's like you cannot just pass it on. You have to open the code editor, see the file executed, see what's happening. But it's quite interesting, this part.
Absolutely. I mean, what I would do, I have a basic sense of it, and I studied the uh, the book that I bought very carefully. But I would study it more, and then of course you'd want to actually open up the actual GitHub code and start studying the documents and see how it all fits together. And then you can paste whole blocks into something like Perplexity and get ask very specific questions. What's this annotated type? It's going to come back with a great answer. Trust me, it's all there. You know how well AI does it, so it's going to say, "Oh, it's this, it's that." Right away, you'll say, "Oh, I get it." You know, it's like if you're troubled by a part of the code, just take a big block and paste it right in, and you keep adding to it, and it just more and more context in, it just keeps on understanding more and more as you add more and more to your your questions.
Yeah, I love using Copilot in ask mode, like rather than agent mode, especially when I'm reading someone else's code, because it's like you just open it, and if you don't understand something, you just ask, "What does this do?" or where is this defined, or something like that, and it's quite useful.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. So I think it looks like a great code base. And this actually, I knew that I was missing something, and so definitely the pipeline action is what I was missing. I think that it's very powerful um, paradigm, the way of this, because you got the decorated pipeline, and then you compose the pipeline with steps. I like that, and then you can go to that ZenML desktop, and because each step you do stuff with the metadata and add it right there. So when you go to the dashboard, you will see everything that you did within that step is organized on that screen. And so it's very powerful the way it's laid out.
Yeah, from all the pipeline tools that I know, is definitely the one that's easier to start using, because then there are others like I love also Kestra or MageDB or some others, but you always have to write like either a specific YAML files to define what's the pipeline or things like that. But in this case, it's just you just write Python code and you decide, okay, this function is a pipeline and these are steps, and you basically will have all monitored, and you can it's quite nice. So does anyone have any question about?
So hey, if well, sorry. I'm running two computers because I have a larger monitor that I was looking at the code on, and I got a little feedback there. So like, I'm just looking over the code, and it seems to me that these crawlers are preparing us for extracting the raw text data to go into our RAG, uh, which is the next chapter, so that we can either set up a RAG concurrently with the LLM, or have data to fine tune the LLM. And my question kind of is, in terms of the pipeline we've established, which is the ZenML Python to the Mongo uh, database, with a NoSQL format. Uh, is this kind of the standard way that people are applying things, or because I don't have a lot of experience with web crawling. I'm like more of a you know data scientist, so usually I get my own data and it's not textual. So like with web crawling, I know Selenium is involved in that, and you know under Chrome. What are the things that we need to know practically to implement this sort of stuff? It's an open question. I have no idea.
So I'm not exactly sure on your question, but I did mention that if you're gonna do it for big production, you would probably use something better, more robust than MongoDB, such as I think I mentioned BigQuery and Snowflake. But you get the idea, and their justification of why they used MongoDB was perfect. So I totally understand that. I think you could even use an SQL database as well. But for example, MySQL does support uh, features like JSON, and I've studied those features so that SQL can sometimes handle these things. But specifically, the book said that if you're going to do it at a professional level, you'd probably be doing something eventually like BigQuery, as I recall, or Snowflake.
Yeah, I think the workflow might be very similar, and but indeed the tools might change. Instead of using SNML, you probably use, I don't know, your company writes your pipelines in Airflow and orchestrate them in that, or any other tool.
Well, yeah,
But
it's
the
kind of like
the
a
yeah,
degree of how much data you have.
uh-huh. But yeah, I feel like the fundamental workflow that we're looking to might be very similar, like
I guess
with the
the
toolings.
authors wanted to have something that was easy to reproduce for everyone, because there is also this thing like they took a particular set of links. So if you look in the repository, there is a YAML file with the links, which is what we are passing to the function that Patrick was telling us. It has a list of the particular links of each of the authors. Which is not very normal. Like to me, a crawler, one of the first features of a crawler is that it sort of gets into a website and extract links as a first step and then navigates all of those links. But in this case, I believe it's kind of trying to tell us, let's get kind of simple on this and just downloading. This is just a representation of a step where we download things. This is our first pipeline. So we have them local and then we can exploit it from the feature pipeline.
Any other question or comment?
Adding a bit on top of what was just discussed, I think another reasoning of like using something like ZenML versus Airflow that author had was I think ZenML has other features that I think for monitoring these ML models that we are going to train, right? So it sort of
Mm-hmm.
provides those additional features, and so it's like you use only one tool to achieve most of your requirements. You don't have to switch between Airflow versus some other thing to
Yeah,
monitor your ML models. I think, yeah, that was the reasoning for that author chose ZenML.
it's great. Anyone else? If not, Carlos, what's the next thing?
Yeah, I guess the next thing is to ask if anyone wants to volunteer for the second part of the chapter for next week. We have a second volunteering chance this week. So
Steven,
You're muted, Stephen.
Sorry, hit the wrong one. Since I joined the group late, I'll volunteer to do the second half of the chapter.
okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Okay, so the last thing is, as you knew, we already decided to start next week with the new sessions for beginners, which we are going to be doing by basically following the book by Aurélien Geron. So we need a volunteer for the session, same thing as we are doing now. Someone to lead us on the first chapter. And I would just say, if there's anyone from the group who was requesting the book, I would suggest them to get started if anyone wants to volunteer, because it's the best way to learn is to actually present one of the sessions. At least that's my experience in the group. So
when is that first session?
next Sunday after the regular session.
Okay, right after this regular session, the LLM engineers is that one.